It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 500 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record where I hold in-depth conversations with today's leading experts in sales, marketing, and leadership 6 days a week. 500 episodes, who could have imagined? I mean, this could not have been possible without the support of all of you, the friends and loyal listeners of Accelerate. I also very much appreciate the fact that you invest your time with me every day, and I hope that the hard work we do is providing you the value you expect with the in-depth and challenging conversations I have with guests on this show. I also appreciate the support of current and past sponsors, and also not to be forgotten, none of this would have been possible without the hard work and excellent efforts of my team, virtual and otherwise. Alec, who's been there from the beginning, helped format the show and get started, continue to be a big influence on day-to-day. Catherine, Ryan, Tim, David, Marty, Taylor, and Rich, thanks so much for all that you do. So joining me on the show for episode 500 is Koka Sexton. Koka is the global industry principal for social selling at Hootsuite. Many of you might also be familiar with Koka from his tenure at LinkedIn. He certainly helped to popularize and formalize the practice of social selling and elevate it into the essential part of sales that it is today. So today I want to talk with Koka about why social selling is really become just selling these days, and talk about how the practice of social selling is going to evolve going forward into the future, what it means for each of you. So, Koka Sexton, welcome to Accelerate.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to being on this podcast for quite a while.
Well, gosh, we'll have to have you on more frequently to compensate for that. We
didn't
mean to make you wait.
Anticipation is good.
Anticipation is always good. I hope the actual experience lives up to the anticipation. Now,
I'm always a big fan of delayed gratification.
Yeah, I was going to say, now I feel pressure. So, all right. So we kick off the show with a question I ask all my guests. It's sort of maybe a research project of mine, maybe. And so this question is, in your mind, what's the single biggest challenge facing sales reps today?
I think the single biggest challenge facing salespeople today is how are they going to fill this pipeline for this, quota that they've been given. I mean, I say that half in jest, but I believe that I think the biggest problem is just how do they adapt. I think salespeople are having a really hard time. I mean, I'd say the bulk of them are having a really hard time adjusting to this idea of how are they going to get in contact and in front of these buyers.
So adapting to how buyers are changing.
Correct.
That's interesting. I mean, and undoubtedly buyers are changing. I mean, and we're seeing sales change, and we're going to talk about some of that change here today. But do we make too much of the change? I mean, is it actually less than it appears to the eye, or is it actually as significant as we think?
Well, I think it is significant. I mean, if you look at the data, you look at, all the analysts out there that are talking about how buyer behavior is continuing to change and how, companies, not just salespeople, how companies are having to adapt and all the millions of dollars and reorganizations that are happening in the enterprise to adapt to this change. I do think it's significant. I believe that this digital transformation that the world is going through, and especially within the enterprise, corporations out there, that it needs to get a name. It needs to be called out so that, the right resources and people can get put behind it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one of the things that I think about when I think about these changes, and in my career, I've been through significant changes as well. I mean, I was not to date myself, but I sold before the internet and, and did a lot of
things our kids will never understand.
Yeah, but it sold a lot to major enterprises overseas where, I was, picking up the phone and dialing, making overseas phone calls, trying to, navigate my way through an organization like, British Telecom. We had no directories, no thing. But one point I keep coming back to, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later in the show, is I look at how much we sold at that point in time, and it was, this was a startup, and we were selling large multi-million-dollar communication systems, but competing very effectively with big established competitors. But I don't see us necessarily selling anymore right now, right? When I look at salespeople, and granted the models have changed and so on, but even the industry research reports say, we're not our performance as a profession isn't really improving. So that's what I was wondering is how much has it really changed, or how much is it just, and I know it's changed, but I mean, in a relative sense, is it just, are we making excuses?
Well, I do think, that's fair, because I do think there are some excuses to it, especially when it's the excuse of why they're not able to keep up, or why they're not staying competitive, or why I didn't hit my number. I believe that you're right. There are some excuses within that, but the excuses should never be that we haven't prepared ourselves.
True.
And I think that's where that significance comes from, is that the data is continuing to show, and there's very clear trends on where the world is going in relation to acquiring customers and keeping customers happy and renewals. I think that using the excuse of, hey, we're not able to adapt isn't real or isn't valid. Because you see companies, and this is why startups are doing so well. In fact, I think you just alluded to it in the story you gave about how you were being extremely competitive, and even in an overseas market. That when a startup is scrappy and is trying to find a way, they're much more agile and much more open to trying new things than some of these established companies that have basically put process above all else and cemented it, and it makes it rigid and unable to adapt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, well, let's dive into social selling. And I have to admit, as I was preparing for the interview, and I was sort of crawling through a variety of websites and blogs and other places I go to gather information, it was like the level of conversation about social selling has diminished quite a bit, at least to my way of reading, over sort of like the last 6 months even. Am I just imagining, or is something sort of happening? Like maybe there's this acceptance phase that we're finally into after certain portions of the sales world sort of were in denial mode.
Well, I would say that there are still some denial.
Oh, there is. There is, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sure there's still denial around this whole idea. And I've got my own theories as to why that is.
Oh, well, yeah. Let's talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if it's diminished. I would say that some of the buzz is going away. So it is probably leveling out. Now, I do think that people are still looking for it, right? Mm-hmm. There's still a lot of exploration in how do we, get our salespeople to become more savvy within social networks. How are they, going to identify, connect, and engage with these buyers in these different mediums? And I've been saying this for years, that eventually social selling is just going to be called sales. And I think in many ways it is. Like social is a part of every modern sales organization in some aspect. If it's not being led from the top, and actually, being pushed down to the teams and how to leverage these tools and these applications and platforms. Mm-hmm. Individual reps are taking the responsibility on their own and doing it on their own.
Yeah, well, you used an interesting word, which is sort of becoming, becoming like a buzzword. Is modern sales, and which is great, and I appreciate that. But we have lots of people listen to the show who, sales professionals doing a great job, but by the definition we use of modern sales, they're not. And I've given this example in the show several times of, talking with a company earlier this year that 100-year-old company with, I think, about 60 outside field salespeople, number one in their market segment. So established company, their strategic initiative for this year was to install the first CRM system. And that's the world outside what I consider sort of the tech bubble.
Yeah.
Is that, we have people in this modern world who are selling proficiently, but not using any of these tools really. I mean, maybe they're using LinkedIn to connect in some cases, but once we get beyond sort of what I consider sort of that first level of let's say social in their sales stack, that may be it.
Well, I think there's also a maturity model, right? When you look at every single industry across the globe, from the tech industry down to healthcare or manufacturing, I think that they're each in their own stage of that maturity model of becoming modern sales or transforming themselves digitally. And you see it typically first start in the marketing departments, where they're realizing that to acquire new customers or to stay relevant in front of their competition, they have to become more digital because that's where the world is going.
Mm-hmm.
And that stage of the maturity then trickles into, okay, well, what else can we do? How else do we transform this company to becoming more relevant in this new era of the internet? And you see it then trickling into the sales teams. Now, that's not to say I come across companies all the time who are skeptical to this idea of leveraging social in any capacity, because they've been operating, in some cases, like you said, 100 years, and they still knock on doors and they still make phone calls, and that's basically their entire MO. And it's working for them. And I think that it will continue working for them until somebody else comes into that industry and totally disrupts it. And that's where you see these behemoth companies struggling because they can't keep up, because somebody else has figured out a new way, some type of hack to get in front of those customers that they already have and the new ones by leveraging digital tools. And that's where you see some of that scrambling around for how do we stay relevant. And I see it even like in the cement industry. Like there's companies like Cemex, mm-hmm. who manufactures and distributes cement and other building materials. Even they are seeing this trend where they need to become more digital, and their sales teams are starting to adapt to it also.
Well, yeah, no, I absolutely agree. But I think this is one of the challenges, though, that I'm trying to sort of address with this podcast, and by having people like yourself and other people from the sales tech world in, is like, how do we help people start making this transition? Because, and I think social is a great first step to do that, by the way, because it's certainly one of the least cost steps to going forward in the digital transformation. But I have a hard time convincing people. And that's why I tell stories like the one I told with this company or other companies that have huge inside sales teams with no sales stack at all. It's like like a homegrown
not even CRM.
Well, they have a home. In this case, I'm thinking companies have a homegrown CRM they've written, but no basic tools like sales intelligence tools like email tracking or anything like that. Just nothing. So it's like, how do we help them start making this digital transformation? Because I really feel like there's this sort of us versus them thing that's out there.
I think it comes down to education. And that's probably the most proactive and positive way of going about it. The other way is sheer disruption, like I was mentioning earlier. So when you can show a company the data around either, let's talk about the social space of where the customers, where their buyers are actually spending time online and the things that they're talking about. It starts with listening for a company. It starts for listening when it comes to a salesperson. Understand what's being talked about. And what that volume looks like, with the email tracking, with things along those lines. I mean, imagine going to a sales. In fact, it's kind of crazy to me that that would even be a conversation where a salesperson wouldn't want to know how often an email is opened, if those links were clicked. That data drives decision making. And
and I think the salespeople do. I think it's a management issue, right?
It is, yeah. And if that's the case, if it's a change management issue, then the leadership needs to understand where the world is going. And they are either keeping their hands in their pockets and pretending like it's not going to, change their lives. And in some cases it won't, because they're going to retire in the next 5-10 years. Or they need to wake up and say, hey, if this company is going to continue to be the top in its class, whatever that means, they have to start adapting to this new era of this digital transformation that everybody's going through.
Yeah. No, I agree, and like I said, it's the way forward is really sort of interesting, because I've got another client I'm thinking of that's a household brand name, selling some very sophisticated technical products, and pretty much the same issue. Right, the salespeople are armed very lightly with the tools that could really help them.
Yeah, and sometimes salespeople just don't want that change either, right?
Well, there's an element. There's certainly an element to that here too. So, yeah, that's why I said we're trying to get the word out. So, another question I have for you is it's sort of along the lines of what we talked about before, but we're still sort of left with this semantics battle, I call it, out there. I got an email this morning, subject line, cold calling is dead.
I love that blank, blank, blank is dead conversation.
Yeah.
I got pulled into it about a month ago.
Well, and I think it's like, and I said this a couple weeks ago on another interview, it's like the most pointless arguments we can possibly have and spend any effort on in sales is, saying something is dead, right? I mean, it's like, first of all, cold calling is not dead. In fact, we've got a renaissance in cold calling happening in many sectors, including the tech sector with SaaS business.
Yeah.
And ironically, this email came from a SaaS company. So that's using cold calling. So it's like, can't we just stop? Can't we just stop?
Yeah, I mean,
it's like, come on, people. It's granted.
Years ago, it was about 2010, so about 7 years ago, when I made the switch, what I call, when I switched to the dark side and took my first marketing role out of being a salesperson. Mm-hmm. I thought that the best way to start cementing this idea of this transformation in the sales stack, social selling as we coined it, we had to make an impact. And so the best way to do that was be sensational and say things along the lines of, the cold call is dead and, social is the way to go. And I was young, naive. And in many ways, I felt like being explosive or confrontational with that type of language needed to be done because it's what woke people up to this whole era that we're facing now.
And granted,
come grow into this to the realization, and I believe this all along, that it doesn't matter. It's just a medium, right? It's all sales. Right. We gave it a name. We called it social selling. We did that because it needed some attention. The same way that in fact, I had this conversation with a friend of mine, on Facebook just yesterday around this idea of women in sales. Like, is it even correct to even give it a name like that? And I believe it is, because if there's a problem, if there is something that needs to get addressed, you have to name it. You have to call it out. Right. And you have to put a spotlight on it, or it's never going to get any attention or resources because people are just they're not going to see it. And so I believe that that's what social selling is. That's what the digital transformation of sales is all about. It's about highlighting this benefit, this problem that companies are continuing to try to sell things. And they're trying to get in front of as many buyers as possible. They're trying to, set themselves apart from the competition and establish themselves in whatever market they're operating in. And the traditional methods, in many cases, are not going to be as impactful as the ones that the buyers are actually paying attention to, which in many cases are social networks. And putting a name to it and calling it out, I think, is still the right thing. But eventually, at the end of the day, it is still just sales. And you have to use whatever applications, platforms, tools, email, phone, whatever it may be, to get in front of those people. So there's always going to be a place for cold calls. Granted, they're not going to be cold calls, I hope, in the desperation.
You'd hope not, right? And that's part of my argument. Is like this document, this ebook, this particular entity was pushing. It's like, sort of roll my eyes. And it's like, okay, fine. What you're really saying is we need to make warm calls, not cold calls. But it's like,
I believe if a company is actually engaging in traditional cold calling tactics, they are setting themselves up for major failure, and it's a sign of desperation.
Well,
you've done something terribly wrong if you're resorting to handing people basically virtual phone books and saying, just call these people and get their attention for us.
Right. Yeah, you'd be a lunatic to do that. But I mean, the fact is, this idea of making warm calls. I mean, I was practicing that decades ago, right? I mean, without all these tools,
great salespeople work, right?
It just makes sense. So it's like, can we just sort of stop with sort of this, divisive rhetoric about cold calling is dead, and then when people spend all this energy online and these forums and then LinkedIn discussion threads, it's like just does. I mean, it seems like we're sort of mirroring like political discussions, right? It's like we have to demonize the people who we don't agree with, because if I'm right, then you must be wrong.
Somebody else is wrong.
And not only must you be wrong, you're stupid too. right? And that's sort of what it. That's
I always
sort
try
of
and stay away from the personal name calling.
right. But that's what it sort of has descended to. You read these discussion threads, it's like, oh, come on. I mean, this is like reading a comment section on a New York Times article or something. It's like, just stop. It's so unproductive. And to your point, it's
it is unproductive, unprofessional.
Selling is selling. This is just one tool. And, granted, making an impact, as you talked about back in 2010 and getting people aware of it. But at this point, if you're not using it, and if you're not proactively making phone calls to customers, warm calls, then you're missing a bet.
Yeah, and you're going to have a lower success rate than the ones who are leveraging this warm aspect of either through social or through referrals or through some other aspect.
Or my point was, if you're not using all the tools you just spent, if you're fortunate enough. And here's the thing, where people get trapped, right? Because we talked about excuses before, and I see this all the time in sales organizations is, people will be reading about, well, we should be able to do this without making cold calls. Oh, that sounds so good. Because I hate cold calls, right?
Yeah.
And then they wonder why they don't have any prospects. It's like, this is not an all or nothing type thing. If you live in a company that's, extremely successful at, how they target their marketing, these highly qualified leads coming in, fantastic. But, for the 99% of the rest of us, we got to use the tools at our disposal, and we're going to use social, and we're going to use proactive outbound calling, and all these, email and all that stuff to fill our pipeline.
Yeah, and every buyer is different. So even though they may be using some type of social network, they may be on Twitter, talking about either their favorite sports team or promoting their company, whatever it may be, or updating their LinkedIn profile. Some people are much more accessible on a phone anyway. I tell people all the time that I get bombarded with email. So if you really need to get a hold of me, the best way is not to send me an email. The people who know me fairly well and need to get my attention, like they'll send me a text because, I'm always on my mobile device. So, I think, the salespeople just need to learn all the different ways and become masters of every way of connecting with these buyers, and then figuring out which way is best for each individual. It's not a cookie cutter approach to everybody. That's what salespeople are good at. They're good at this one-to-one communication, and they just need to find the best ways to do it. If it's email, fine. If it's getting them on the phone, fine. If it's text messages, SMS, then do that. But that's one of those learning processes for every salesperson to figure out how to connect with individuals.
Well, and there's no hiding. So for anybody listening to the show, there's just no hiding, right? I mean, it's you got to do what you got to do, and I know people, like I said, they grasp for some of these latest methods like social selling and others because they think it's going to take away the need to do the things that are really hard in sales. And
may lessen some of that pain. But I mean, again, I think that social selling is more about playing the long game.
Yep.
Than, trying to fill your pipeline this month or this week, whatever it may be. Social selling is really about how are you establishing yourself as a professional within a specific industry. With that idea of generating new opportunities and connecting with the right people. I said earlier on, the selling habit, visibility creates opportunity. And that is the best piece of advice I came across when I was in sales.
All right. So let me ask you a question about that, though, because this is an area that's still very controversial. And I think it was from a blog article actually on Hootsuite that I read that said that 92% of B2B buyers are willing to engage with, this is a quote, willing to engage with a sales professional who is a known industry thought leader, a reputation you can establish by consistently posting thoughtful, relevant content on social media. Yeah, most sales leaders say, I don't want my salespeople posting anything. In terms of this idea of them being a thought leader. I mean, so
yeah, it's an excellent point. So I think that data actually comes from either the IDC, because I know the stat. It either came from an IDC or maybe even something that LinkedIn had done internally, or with their own serving capabilities with their massive database. But this idea of connecting with these decision makers is and being seen as a thought leader. I think it's just the wrong words. Now, I don't think that most sales professionals, I don't think that most professionals, regardless of what their role is, want to be thought leaders. Right? There's a very select group of people that actually strive to be seen as a thought leader in a space.
Like Koka Sexton.
Well, we can get to that in a second because I didn't strive for it.
Well, no, I know. It
but
happened,
I do believe that most professionals, regardless of role, want to be seen as experts in something. There is some level of awareness that they want to achieve. They want to be seen as credible within the industry they're in.
Well, and I'm going to interject for a second, though, because this is really a critical point, is you don't want to be positioned or conceive of yourself and position yourself with your buyers as a sales expert. It's the expert on what you're...
An expert yes, correct. An expert in the specific space that you work in.
But I mean, there are no shortage of LinkedIn profiles from salespeople that what they're really touting is their sales expertise, and the customers don't care. No,
because again, this idea, part of this, again, I'm going to say visibility creates opportunity a million times, but this whole idea that you create your LinkedIn profile based on your own, ego, I'll just, for lack of a better term, we went through this transformation even when I'd been at LinkedIn, and I still promote it whenever I talk to companies, is that individuals need to move from resume to reputation. And most people create their online personas as if it's their online resume. They talk about, it's all about me. Here's what I've done. Here's the greatness that I've accomplished. With the hopes that somehow this is going to help them get a better job. But that's not really the purpose of these networks. If you're using them as a professional, maybe it is for a short period of time, but hopefully you have a job. So your profile should be focused on your customer. It should be very buyer centric, so that when somebody goes to it, they're actually getting value from it and not just reading about, how many times you've gone to club, because most buyers could care less. They want to know how you're going to add value or solve their problems. And that's how you should be leveraging these social networks. And it's not, unfortunately. And so one of the things that's sort of a trend that, a little off-putting oftentimes is we're seeing, just within the last 6 months, it's like the updates, people posting updates instead of articles that are these questions, and then they, tag everybody and their brother to try to elicit a response from them. I think that's one of those tactics that translates over from a Twitter or a Facebook. LinkedIn is as great of a platform as it is. LinkedIn always gets upset when I talk about them and say anything negative because I used to work there. Yes. As great of a platform as it is, they're still catching up to some of these social capabilities. Like the idea of mentioning somebody in a status update is still relatively new in comparative to Twitter and Facebook, right? On LinkedIn, and some people that just abuse it, and I see it all the time. I kind of let it shrug off my shoulder, but I can see how it can be an annoyance for many people, especially within the context that some of these updates are. Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's a question, and maybe the last question because we're beginning to run out of time here, but I thought it was really interesting. This also came from the same Hootsuite blog post. And I thought it was the most, there was the statistics is, list of statistics as long as my arm in the article. But the one I thought was actually the most authentic and honest was that it said 38% of sellers had no idea how social benefited them. And that's because they don't measure it. It's 38%. I mean, it's a pretty large group that actually do see the value. But I'd say those 38%, it's because them as individuals or the company have not found a way to actually track this effectively. Actually, I had a different interpretation, which is not that they didn't necessarily see value, but it's like a lot of things in sales these days and a lot of data we get is we see correlation, but we confuse that with causality, right? And so it's not like, I think that 38 would never stop using it because they know it's doing something. They just don't know what. And I think we have to start the issue in sales in general with, with all the sales technology and so on is, I don't want to do without it. I use a lot of it. I don't want to do without it. But even the data is sort of misleading in terms of, quantifying the real value we're getting from it because
by the same token, we get these reports from CSO Insights and Forrester and so on saying, sales performance, sales productivity doesn't really seem like it's changing.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They'll probably still continue using it. And again, I think it's a lack of understanding of what that value is.
So how do we capture that? That's really the question. How do we capture that in a way that's really meaningful? And instead of just, data point after data point, which I said is maybe correlates, but doesn't really get to the heart of the matter of why things happen, is how do we really, how do we put this whole thing to bed by saying,
well, I think you start tracking
the outcome.
Tracking the activity.
Well, it's really outcomes, right?
Yeah, it's outcomes. I mean, that's the why sales leadership, traditionally looks at how many phone calls have you made and what was your talk time. That those two metrics should equal out to some level of pipeline generation if you're good in sales. And the companies that are doing this amazingly well, be it ADT, Microsoft, SAS, they have built activity metrics in this. So when did you connect with them on LinkedIn? When did you start following them on Twitter? Have you engaged with any of these status updates? And when they're able to measure that, along with the other traditional stuff of email and phone calls and demos scheduled and things along those lines, they do see how this is helping out. And that's why they're investing so much heavier into these technologies and into the training for their sales teams to become more efficient at these activities.
Interesting. So now that I like, and you don't hear of many companies actually doing that.
And it's growing. It's growing fast. Yesterday I was actually at a huge enterprise, in Palo Alto that is starting down this path, and they realize they're a massive corporation, and they are now coming to this realization that they need to start equipping their sales force with the right tools and process to become more effective in this age where they're seeing their competitors already taking business away from them in these networks.
But to your point, is then also tying in the social selling metrics with their other metrics, other activity metrics,
and that's what they're trying to figure out.
Getting a complete picture.
How are we actually going to track the value from this outside of? We can't just give these people all these tools and teach them how to leverage, Twitter and LinkedIn to identify conversations and engage with it. Like, how are we actually going to measure it? And the best way of doing that is within your own CRM. And so finding ways to add that activity as easy as possible, either automatically through a platform or some easy drop downs or something that the salesperson's already doing when they're in their CRM to track that behavior and then optimize for the best outcomes.
Okay, I'm glad I asked that question because that's very encouraging. If we start getting that holistic look at things, then that to me that's exciting, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
As long as we sort of, like Sarah said, well, yeah, you do the social selling over here, but we're not really tracking it because it's just sort of warming things up. If it's not
generating pipeline, then you shouldn't be doing it, right?
Exactly.
And so you have to find ways to measure that. And there are ways. 10 years ago, there wasn't very many ways. And that was one of the biggest struggles that I had when I was initially started talking about this whole idea of social selling. There were very little metrics in place, but now technology is actually caught up. And companies are being able have innovated and figured out like they can track this activity and they can say, oh, after the second voicemail, connect with them on LinkedIn, follow them on Twitter, reply to a tweet, then send them an email and reference all of that, and your chances grow X percentage. And when a company can map out those behaviors, that playbook, they have a blueprint for success that they can just run through.
Love it. Oh, good. Well, I'm glad I asked that question. Perfect way to end the show. Koka, it's pleasure talking to you. We're going to have to do this again here shortly.
Absolutely. Hey, I'll come on anytime you want, Andy.
All right. Well, good. Well, I'm going to hold you to that. So tell folks how they can connect with you and get a hold of you.
So the best way to get a hold of me, follow me on Twitter. I'm at Koka Sexton. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. And follow the Hootsuite blog. You're going to start seeing a lot more content from me on there as well.
Excellent. Well, good. Well, Koka, again, thanks for joining me. Friends, thank you for spending this time with us today. Make sure you come back again tomorrow. Join us for another great episode of Accelerate. So thanks for joining me. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.